Hello folks, and welcome to another edition of Know Your Unit. Today we talk about the basic Wizard and Enchantress, a class that, as with many on this list, doesn't typically get the love it deserves, especially into the endgame. So typically common knowledge on these guys is going to be something along the lines of, well, they're your basic caster, they're what you have in the early game, and then you just kind of throw them in the dumpster as time goes on, because they don't, get the gimmicks that some of the others do. Or, the old argument of, switch over to the Warlock or Witch right away because stats, or, Shamans, all that kind of thing. But essentially, here's how it kind of breaks down. Every class in this game, especially, we're going to just talk about casters in this case, will have their own gimmick when it comes to the end game. Every one of them will function very differently from the beginning to the end. The post game has a lot of crazy stuff going around, which means in general you kind of have the sort of XCOM problem where early on, it's relatively person-to-person engagement, and by the time you're running around in the post game, if you don't have map-wide access in a lot of cases, you're going to have a bit more trouble. This is why, for example, you typically see a lot more stuff like, warriors relying on finishers at long range, or archers relying on some of those extremely long ranges, or, for example, something like Terror Knights relying on their spells more. These are just some side examples, but either way, you get the idea. You typically want to have more stuff to your class by that point. So, for example, something like the Valkyrie or Rune Fencer will come in with the ability to essentially cast for free. They've got multiple ways to regenerate MP, functionally meaning that they never have to stop. Or you have something like the Warlock who brings in Golem support. Or you have something like the Necromancer who brings in zombie support as well as the cool suite of necromancy spells. Or you have the Lich, who is the Necromancer but better in every possible conceivable way, as well as also having infinite MP because they're freaking amazing. Then you have something like the Shaman, going for just trying to min-max just hard damage numbers entirely, and then you have the Witch, interestingly enough, or the Wiche, this time around coming in with the sort of gimmick of almost being a hybrid melee finisher type of spammer situation. Count that as you will. Or you got the Songstress coming in previously as an Artificer. This time around, she's kind of still got some of that feel, but essentially showing up as a support finisher spammer, once again, or something like the Familiar, where they're just going to be good at a lot of different things, or something like the Patriarch and Matriarch, where they're going and they're, throwing away some of that min-maxing for their hyper armor. Essentially, every caster in this game has something that keeps them relevant in the endgame, and in the case of the Wizard and Enchantress, that is their speed. They are, hands down, the fastest caster in the game. Now, that being said, they actually have some pretty decent access to a lot of different things, and for the sake of comparison, I want to point out, in terms of speed, typically, I know this is kind of a tired thing at this point, but when it comes to comparing basic Wizard and Shaman, for example, the unique class advantage in this case is only giving them 6 RT cost. Meanwhile, something like Conserve RT is going to, typically speaking, give them roughly about 20% of their RT back, going from like 19, 20, all of that kind of thing here. Typically, you're looking at about 15 to 24 when it comes to the kinds of spells that they can use. Which means, if, for example, you've been watching that AI run by any means, these guys are freaking fast once they get going. So anyway, let's get into it here. What kind of skills do they actually have? Well, right off the bat, we've got daggers for that big earth finish and the big neutral scalar. You've got hammers coming in with your ice, your fire, and your lightning. That fire AoE being particularly devastating under the right circumstances. Essentially allowing a caster to go from, for example, using concentration to drop some poison, to using some health steal to keep itself alive, to essentially going in for a big AoE, hammer finish under the right circumstances. Again, all kinds of different options to deal with all kinds of different defenses. And then you have the cudgels coming in, arguably the weakest option of the bunch, because they're simply going to have, the cudgel moves, so they're all going to be divine, but hey, these have their own particular purpose, and especially if you were to shut off everything but Pressure Whirl here, that would essentially allow for setting up a couple of, for example, automatic casters that would be able to mass spam their Enfeeble on everything in a group, so that can be potentially very handy. Now, just like every other caster type in this game, they do have the ability to be built for crit. So for example, right here, 15 luck, 30 luck, suddenly going up to 50 luck, and then, you go over to their personal luck for that day, and they're basically saying, yeah, everything is absolutely perfect, your luck is amazing all the time. This means that just like all caster types, they're available to go and drop those crits right away. I say just caster types, everybody can be built for crit under the right circumstances, but the interesting thing is that, yeah, combine that with Conserve RT, combine that with access to every element worth of gigantic splash damage, combine that with the fact that they're, regenerating MP pretty darn well, you have a class that can essentially momentum build their way in a really crazy way. When you need to scatter fire, these guys are amazing. So, Let's kind of go over some more of their skills here. So weapons aside, they get their usual, insight. It's not really going to become relevant for them. Even for a finisher spammer build, they have enough MP on their own, so you'll typically not run Insight. Petrify, Charm, still wondering what they're doing here. Coax for getting the Patriarch, which, yeah, I mean, let's be honest, I'll take a Patriarch over a Wizard any day, but still, it's there. Meditate, because of course it is. Engulf, because everybody gets that. This actually used to be, funnily enough, just like the Shaman lost its unique skill, so did the Wizard. In this case, their unique skill is just Conserve RT. This Engulf used to be Wizard only in the original. That is to say, the PSP version. Essentially, this used to be Extend, and this used to be only them. So their relevant thing before was becoming Artillery. This time, everybody becomes Artillery, so the relevant thing is being just the frickin' Turbocaster. And then, yeah, you have your concentration at the bottom, which, again, will give you minimum 30% odds to hit your debuffs, which basically means that, yeah, you can spam your poisons or whatever else. And honestly, if there was the option to allow the AI to go and spam poison, essentially, Zombie Wizard just spamming poison could kill practically anything in this game on its own. So either way, yeah, never underestimate how good, something like poison spam concentration can be. But again, this scales particularly well against stuff with really high HP. Which, by the way, a few folks have wondered, what's the deal with poison sometimes hitting more or sometimes less? So that's actually something I plan to make a separate video on. We'll get to that when we get to it. But just so you know, that is coming down the road. For now, since this is an all-AI team, we'll do the usual thing of just going and giving them all of their stuff here. The typical tiering out your spells in different ways. So let's go ahead and give him, for example, a cheap Avalanche, an expensive Avalanche, a kind of medium road Avalanche, as well as a Health Steal to keep themselves running. Because Health Steal and Run is actually pretty effective, especially for something like Conserve RT. It's a relatively quick spell to begin with, but it does allow them to recover and keep going, so this can be handy under the right circumstances. Again, if you are running an AI team, especially if you're running something like zombies, having access to that Health Steal can be absolutely immense in terms of saving time and all of that kind of thing. So let's go ahead and show these guys off a little bit. Again, they're not exactly particularly sexy by any means. They are essentially vanilla, and vanilla that suddenly shows up faster, but they are still going to get the job done one way or another. See, part of the thing with Magic in this particular game here is just the fact that it is a lot more... Let me actually turn those effects down a little bit. It's actually a lot less resisted than you may think it is. So essentially that's the reason that it always seems so consistent. It's not necessarily that it's more powerful than other things, it's essentially just resisted less. Now, effectively what this translates to is the fact that even the lower tier abilities, even though they may seem like they're doing, less on paper, can potentially allow it for a very good kind of cost-saving analysis as time goes on. That's a weird way to put that. But essentially, yeah, if you compare the two side by side, a lot of times just using a cheaper thing to save yourself a little bit of time could be a decent bit more useful than going for something more expensive. Would it be ideal to throw out the big nuke every single time? Yeah, sure, absolutely. You'd be shocked how often that argument comes up, but anyway. Yes, obviously, bigger number, better, but in order to achieve bigger number more consistently, sometimes you have to use smaller number. Haha. Anyway, so, moving on here. Are they going to necessarily one-shot everything in the universe? No. And in fact, their initial hits may seem comparatively low next to a lot of other things, but remember, they are still essentially saving about 20% of their speed every time that they act. This essentially means, again, they will... If you're thinking about the equation this way, you can more or less double their turns for every four actions that they take. And essentially in the case of something like a crit build, for example, if they're going and they're doing multiple splashes in a lot of different ways, you can essentially see how, in essence, this kind of becomes the same multiplication equation that every other class relies on when it comes to the end game. Essentially, whether you're relying on scaling damage from a lot of equipment bonuses, or if you're going and, using summons to use smaller abilities over and over, essentially the math of this all shakes out in a way where they can just constantly spam different things. So, again, it's a little hard to tell, it's a little hard to compare their numbers directly, but the way that I consider it is just, you kind of consider that every fourth turn is free for them, give or take. Not that this is math that you necessarily need to keep in your head, but you still get the general idea. Now, additionally, when it comes to access to these finishers and things like that, this means that if there's certain things that are more resistant to this type of spells that they're packing, it does give them a way to potentially punish that pretty effectively. Anyway, So as you can see here, again, lower initial hits, but you're going to see a lot more initial hits. And funnily enough, the basic spells actually have a lot more callouts than many of the other ones, which kind of leads to this funny situation where they actually, like, if you compare the two side by side, like if you were to compare I say two, but it's more like if you combine every caster class side by side, when it comes to the actual amount of RT used, enchanters and wizards and things like that typically will be on the higher end of that whole thing speed-wise, but again, when it comes to RT used, but due to the fact that they have so many callouts and the fact that all of their actions essentially take multiple turns to achieve, but they're just getting turns more often, this translates to them typically having slower kind of real-world time. Is this necessarily relevant for anything outside of a speedrun? Not necessarily, but I will say these guys absolutely shine when it comes to the post-game kind of, if you want to grind for relics and things like that. You may have noticed a lot of these guys are running exorcism stabs and a lot of splash moves. So, again, we'll see a lot more of this coming up in the AI run. But having access to a essentially turbo caster, just splashing everything for crits, as well as something that packs an exorcism just kind of for the hell of it, essentially means that they can more or less artillery practically anything. They're essentially a long-range meat grinder, but still exercising stuff. Can you do this with other casters as well? True, but you can't replace any of the other ones as easily. Especially considering that you can go into Farampa and get zombie versions of this pretty much infinitely for free. So you can just replace this ad nauseum. Everything that they do, like, they can essentially be maxed out in this particular condition right out of the store. You don't need to go out of your way to pick up a bajillion different relics. They're just fine as is. Which actually, on that particular note, I should point out that when it comes to relics, there's practically no relics required for these guys. Most of their higher tier spells are going to be available pretty frequently when it comes to the post-game. You'll probably get a lot of them by accident. When it comes to a lot of their relics and things like that, outside of something like Garb of Sages, yeah, you don't really have to worry about getting relics for them. Basically, you can get a Ripple's Rod if you want them to be able to, for example, get their elemental bonus using a lot of different types of spells. Realistically, they might as well just stick to their particular element. Like in their case, they typically, if you tier out their spells, you can just use you can set up all of them in pretty much the same way, unless you're going and using, for example, poison for your own guys. But yeah, there's nothing particularly fancy to be done here to make all of that work. Defensively speaking, again, Garb of Sages, as well as something like a lot of the traversal boots, and like typically like flying boots, something like a warp ring maybe. Just any of those rings will typically, just like every other caster in the game, render them near immune to physical damage if you give them enough stuff. If you have the zombie versions, again, this essentially means that only the kill move can possibly kill them. So, for example, one of the ones that sticks out pretty darn well is something like a water caster. You may have noticed that I've had a lot of water casters in different tests and things. Partially the reason for this is because, like, let's say you're taking your water caster there and they're having an issue with lightning. That is their primary weakness, so you give them some sandstorm robes or, Garb of Sages. You get them some upgraded earth boots and things like that. You get them their warp ring or flight ring or something like that. And typically this will give them enough resistance to basically plink damage. So for example, if you've seen those arguments for like, oh, you only got to use shamans because they can defend against everything, it's not shamans, it's the relics. Everyone's getting relics and shamans at the same time and throwing a lot of these other casters in the dumpster, when realistically every class can achieve this. Again, what you're looking at right now, just like with every one of these tests, is the by far crappiest version that they can possibly achieve. This is using only blue and green items from the shop, just basic craftables and things like that, to show their worst case scenario. And essentially the idea being that, hey, look, they're going into a situation where they're under-leveled, they're using out-of-the-shop garbage, they're still holding up, that kind of stuff. Because I feel like many folks have had that experience where they've gone into San Bronzo 1 and gotten thoroughly whooped, and then immediately thought, oh, it's time to go grind. And I get it. I had that exact same experience of like, wow, this got way harder upon first getting here. And then a lot of those mechanics started to suddenly sink in, So, for example, even something as simple as like the upgrade from a boulder, like basic boulder shield to boulder +1. I'm not sure how many realize that that's like a 5-6% damage reduction against almost all damage types, because from what I understand it, physical checks before magical. So for example, if you see a summon and it says like, hey, it's a crushing type of damage, essentially what it's translating to is like your physical weapon is a crushing type of thing. And like, let's say, actually in the case of one of them, I had a guy, here, let me see if I have Alos around here somewhere. Let me show you what this translates to in the most basic sense. So in his particular case, if we're looking over his items, essentially he's got 2%, 6%, 8%, 12%, 9% plus an elemental resist, and then 15% with this. So essentially, just by using this knife, essentially he's giving himself 15% resistance against physical, which apparently also takes place before any like magic type that has a damage type associated with it, like physical damage type associated with it. Which again is a weird way to describe all of this stuff. I'm sure Recession will be around to explain more of the nitty-gritty, but basically what it comes down to is that you can, even in the crappiest version, tailor their armor to a degree that they can withstand a lot of this damage here. Is it, again, do I wish that they had described this a little bit better in the actual in-game tooltips? Sure, absolutely, and who knows, maybe someday it will, but still, that's kind of what it all translates to here. Alright. So, with that all being said, just like every other caster type, you give them a magic up card, give them a crit card, they'll be running around, splash destroying stuff in no time. Bear in mind that since they are using a lot of cheaper abilities, as it were, this also means that you'll typically see a lot better returns when it comes to using them. Like a lot of the really high tier stuff, like your Apocryphas and stuff like that, you typically will end up seeing far less return when you're going and using like magic cards and things like that. At least comparatively speaking, it feels like there's less of a return. Technically, it's a flat amount, but typically it'll feel like there's less of a return. But for example, if you're using a big splash ability, you have a crit on there, you have some luck build on there, you have a magic up card, and essentially, you're suddenly seeing several splashes of, 400 or 500s, whatever, in a huge area. It's more than enough to keep the pressure on, and that's really all you need. So, that all being said, hopefully this is helpful for some of y'all out there. But yeah, don't just throw these guys in the trash. They're actually pretty darn good. And if you're looking for a caster that you can easily throw into dangerous situations to do the grunt work without having to worry about getting them anything particularly fancy to function, yeah, 100%, go for these guys. Or if you're just looking for somebody that's fast, go for it. As with everything, you don't really need to necessarily worry about the stats, because again, these guys were trained as basic warriors, and they're still, as you can see, doing just fine. Also, funnily enough, I think that's one of the few Mage Knight marks I've ever seen drop. For some reason, they're way more rare in this version. Alright, anyway, so that's about that on these guys. They're not the most complicated thing in the world. They are wizard, and then they become fast wizard. Alright, y'all have a good one. Take care.